absolutely. Okay, well, I think we're still rolling in a little bit, but we have quite a few in. So we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Lauren Hawthorne with Uptimize, and I will be your host. And we are excited to be back with our monthly Neurodiversity at Work webinars and panel discussions. And kicking off this year, we'll be discussing the business case for recruiting neurodiverse talent at your organization. The war for talent is certainly back on, especially in the US. I think we have some attendees that are outside of the US, but we are experiencing the great resignation. And so we thought it would be very relevant and an important time to discuss why and how companies are ensuring that their diversity and inclusion programs and their talent management processes are what we at Uptimize call neuro-inclusive, and how this drives effective recruitment from a vast but very often overlooked talent pool. We have a special guest with us today, Jan Coplan from Landmark College. Landmark is an institution exclusively for students who identify as neurodistinct or neurodivergent. Before I introduce our panelists, just a very quick introduction to Uptimize if you haven't been a part of our webinars before. We are the leading provider of enterprise neurodiversity training, specifically focused on neurodiversity at work. We work with companies like Google, Salesforce, IBM to train staff in what we call neuro-inclusion to help create more inclusive cultures and better team collaboration. So we are also joined by our CEO and founder, Ed Thompson, who has a unique perspective working with employers in their neurodiversity programs over the years. Ed, can I have you discuss your role with Uptimize, introduce yourself, and how you work with organizations in their neurodiversity initiatives?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, and happy to have you, Jan, on this webinar. So I'm Ed, I'm the founder and CEO of Uptimize. Why do we exist? Well, we know diversity and inclusion is vital in meeting business goals, proven. And we believe neurodiversity must be part of any DE&I program, given that perhaps as many as 1 in 5 people are neurodistinct in some way. We don't know the numbers, 1 in 5, 1 in 7, but it's a very significant group and a group that we know through research very typically masks and feels uncomfortable sharing the thinking style. And unlike other aspects of diversity, neurodiversity is hidden, and we know and we have seen considerable ignorance and prejudice leads to unintentional exclusion. So even if you like the idea of hiring talent that thinks differently, the likelihood is you're not doing that as well as you could be in the current state, where folks typically have a fairly low understanding of the topic. And neurodiversity also ultimately includes everybody, right? And that means that everybody benefits from efforts to consider how people think differently. So a manager more conscious of differences in a team, that's something that's going to benefit everybody in that team in terms of, you know, being asked how they like to communicate, how they like to problem solve, and so on. So at Uptimize, as Lauren introduced, we partner with organizations putting our corporate training tools and advisory services to work to help our partner customers attract untapped talent, boost engagement, belonging, well-being, and transform team collaboration. And that typically tends to take the form of either a hiring initiative, supporting a hiring initiative specifically to support the hiring of neurodistinct talent, or a wider, broader enterprise level awareness program where organizations work with us to really kind of set that foundation to make sure that the whole organization and the experience that folks have within it is neuro-inclusive.
Great. And Jan, can you introduce yourself, tell us about Landmark College, and tell us about Landmark's role in neurodiversity hiring?
Sure. So I'm Jan Coplan. I'm the Director of Career Connections. My role at Landmark is to oversee the career office, but also a large part of the work that I do is building partnerships and working with companies that not only want to know more about neurodiversity, but be trained and how they can implement these programs as far as hiring Landmark grads or Landmark enrolled students. Before I go any further in my role, I think it's really important to describe the uniqueness of Landmark College. We are a very small liberal arts college in Southern Vermont. And when I say small, we're 400 students. We are a degree granting institution. So we award bachelor and associate's degrees. But as I said, the unique element of Landmark is that we are completely neurodiverse. So every enrolled student has a diagnosed learning difference. So those 400 students either have disclosed neurodiversity or have a diagnosed learning difference. Another important distinction is that 1/3 of our student population is on the autism spectrum. They may have a co-occurring diagnosis as well, but they have disclosed that they are on the spectrum. So my role in partnership and also the neurodiversity hiring movement is, as I mentioned, to build partnerships, to work with corporations, to make them aware of our students' abilities and our programming and our approach to career readiness. We also take a very active role, my team and I and the college take a very active role in being part of communities of practice, like the Neurodiversity Hub. We are both contributors to the Neurodiversity Hub as well as taking an active role in it. In addition, we have a research center right on campus. So a large part of the work that I do and the way that I work with students and our practices is informed by research. Landmark College was established in 1989. So for that many years, we have been researching neurodiversity as far back as ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and now autism. So everything we do is based in research from Landmark College, as well as following what are the current trends in research.
Excellent. Thank you, Jan. That's really interesting. I didn't know all of that about Landmark College. That's amazing. And Uptimize recently, we published an article about, what the trends we're seeing in neurodiversity at work in 2022 and 2021. And we're seeing that universities are embracing neurodiversity programs, but you've been doing it since the beginning, basically, in 1989. That's really amazing. All right, quickly. So for our audience, I'm very aware of Zoom fatigue, and that is very real. So we want to be conscious of that. We're going to be keeping our talk to about 40 minutes at the most. So before we get started, really quickly, now that you know Landmark and Uptimize a little bit better, we'd like to ask you a few questions about how you would like us to drive the conversation today. So if you have your cell phone handy, all you have to do is open up the camera and scan that QR code on the screen, and that should open up the questions for our polls. You can also go to menti.com and enter the code here, 12208692, and that will work as well. I will get started. Let's see, the next question here. Oh, 1 second. Oh. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. So does your company actively hire neurodiverse talent? So what we mean by that is, are your hiring practices or talent management processes neuro-inclusive? Give that a second. So we have 5 yes and 4 no. So that's amazing. Usually I would have expected the majority to say no or I don't know. So that's really amazing. So we will keep that in mind. We are preaching to the choir. Oh, okay, so now we're going back up. No, we got about 50-50. So we do have some yeses and some nos and 1 I don't know. Our next question is not cooperating with me very well today. Is more of an open-ended question. We want to ask the audience, now that you know us a little bit better, what do you hope to gain from the session today? What questions would you like to ask our panelists? And it could be anything from hiring, a little bit more about Landmark, a little bit more about Uptimize. What do you hope to gain from the session? And I'll give that a moment. Okay, learn new techniques for neurodiverse hiring. We can definitely discuss that. Business case data proving impact of hiring and growing neurodiverse talent. We definitely have some stories that we can share of statistics and successes of organizations hiring neurodiverse talent. How can neurodiverse hiring be measured by ROI? Ideas of how to better market our autistic candidates who may be recent or soon to be graduates. That is absolutely what we will be talking about today. Recommendations on how to create and support programs, finding partners to access neurodiverse talent, neurodiverse, seeing a common theme of recruiting specifically neurodiversity friendly practices. We can definitely discuss that. So okay, well with those responses in mind, we will get to our panel questions. So Ed, I would like to start the questioning with you. As someone who has worked with many companies over the years, not just companies, but organizations, how have companies seen success with neurodiversity programs, not just with hiring, but with full neuro-inclusion programs, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so that really started, I think, what we could call the kind of neuro-inclusion, neurodiversity at work movement started with organizations looking at hiring programs. And that remains one of the approaches to creating more neurodiversity in an organization and supporting it. Really, I would put in that same bracket any kind of local initiative to support folks who have disclosed. So what we're really talking about is something that isn't kind of across the board in an organization, but which is local specific, where either through a targeted hiring program or simply through, a manager and a colleague together saying, look, we'd love to have some resources here for Chris because Chris has asked for some support. That context, that has, some benefits, some needs, and some typical successes and results. Obviously, any program that requires, where there is a particular goal to hire people from within a particular neuroidentity group, typically involves partnerships to source from that demographic. These programs are typically sort of smallish scale. Because of you're actually sort of looking at how do we change our processes, our approach, even our talent sourcing. So it's I think not necessarily designed from the beginning to be systemic or kind of across the board. But organizations have seen great successes from these programs in terms of hiring folks, in terms of those hirings working out well, hiring into multiple roles, helping folks develop in their career, and also, and this is where we sort of start bridging into the rest of the organization, inspiring other people in the organization. And part of that inspiring is actually encouraging people in the rest of the organization to feel comfortable disclosing. And that has been a very significant thing in this field over the last few years, where I think when those programs started, most of those organizations did not have a open, confident sort of body of neurodistinct employees advocating for their needs in the form of a resource group and so on. And so the perspective was more, well, we don't have that many people from those groups. How do we go out and hire them? What's happened is those folks have increasingly started to say, actually, we're here anyway, what about us? Right, particularly in any large organization. And so the second approach here, and these two things can tie with some organizations' approach, one has led to approach to. The second approach is really about more systemic, proactive inclusion across the board, education and awareness of neurodiversity, right? So the difference is, are we saying, okay, one particular manager is going to be managing someone who's autistic next week, we need to train that manager, but everyone else probably okay? Or are we saying actually any manager manages a neurodiverse team by definition, everyone's brain is different. And regardless of whether somebody has disclosed or not, it's probably a good thing for those managers, those hiring managers, those recruiters, those colleagues to be aware of those thinking differences. And so that's typically been where we've seen organizations go. And I think that's great. I think that's smart. And I think you see some significant success from that. We've pretty much uniformly seen our customers, even from that sort of more proactive approach, say, look, this is in itself hiring people that we wouldn't have hired. This is in itself inspiring people to self-disclose and feel comfortable doing that. And this is also helping us achieve more effective collaboration, because we can imagine what's the difference in a team where in one team, nobody knows about neurodiversity, nobody cares, maybe one person is neurodistinct but doesn't want to share it. The manager is managing everybody like they would like to be managed, not how other people actually process information. Now let's transform that team to one where everybody can talk about neurodiversity, everybody can surface some of these preferences around communication, problem solving, how we like to manage our work and so on. The manager's giving instructions tailored to how each individual processes information. That is actually a really powerful thing and something that's valuable for everybody and mission critical perhaps for that one neurodistinct person who would say, look, if my manager gets me, I'm great. But if the manager doesn't care about how I think and how I'm different, this is going to be an uphill struggle. So those would be the two major approaches that we've seen.
Yeah. Absolutely. We have a comment in the chat as well as teaching individuals how to self-advocate and disclosing is also an area that we've seen is very difficult for anybody, and it's very scary. And we've seen from our focus groups that it's coming out, and that's a risk. And so that is also something that is empowering. If your team knows about this and knows about the power of neurodiversity and the power of neuro-inclusion, it totally empowers the employee to bring their full selves to work. What benefits, Jan, I'd like to switch to, can come from partnering with colleges like Landmark to recruit these students, and why wouldn't someone just go out and do it on their own?
There's numerous benefits. As I mentioned, we're fairly unique in our population, so that allows us to really hone in on just not your typical career coaching, but very intentional, scaffolded career readiness programming, as well as we meet with students one-on-one and do career coaching throughout the semester. So the benefits, as I said, are numerous. We know our students. So if a student is doing an internship or is employed and there's questions that the employer has, or they're learning about a diagnosis, they can reach us. But typically we empower the student and we equip the student, and through their work with us, and because of the ecosystem at Landmark's campus, they know how to self-advocate. They know how to lead from a neurodiverse, confident perspective. So in hiring a Landmark student or someone who's been in a similar program, a lot of those challenges that a supervisor may face or the employee may face are already out in the open, that those things have been discussed. And the partners I work with, some of them pictured in this photo right here, Anthony Pacilio of Computer Aid and Jamel Mitchell at EY, they're on campus. They come to campus, they do info sessions, they interview, they know Landmark well, and they get to know our students well. And then they also learn from the students how can they enhance their practices? How can they alter some of the things that they're doing, because they're listening to the neurodiverse voice and gaining that perspective. So it's a real dialogue. It's not someone dictating, there's a dialogue. So our students are gaining more and more confidence in being able to go with that idea of not about us without us, that they're contributing to the trends. And Landmark, because we're experts in neurodiversity, and as I mentioned, our work is informed by research. So when we are working with corporate partners, all that research is brought into the way that we have the students embark on the program.
That's amazing. And you had mentioned that you do some one-on-one coaching with the students. What else does Landmark do to prep students for starting their careers?
Well, I think the programming, we have workshops on a weekly basis. The typical workshops you'd see in another college campus, but you imagine a neurodiverse candidate that is embarking on an elevator pitch or networking. So we're offering workshops in those areas with the neurodiverse lens. You know, these are really, for some students, these things like a resume or a cover letter, with a little bit of instruction, they're fine. But elevator pitch, interviewing, networking, getting themselves out there, being proactive, you have to take into account what are some of these students' prior experiences. They're coming from some trauma, they're coming from lack of confidence. So we empower them to understand the superpowers, as we refer to, or the cool abilities of their diagnosis. So when they're networking and during their elevator pitch or just closing, they are learning how to speak about the strengths of their diagnosis. And we break it into smaller pieces so that they are able to absorb it and implement it and present in a way that is not necessarily how they verbally communicate their skills, but how are they showing, here's an example, here's an artifact. And that's what's so wonderful about these partners in the corporate neurodiverse inclusive movement, is they're not just relying on an interview. They're saying, can we give you this assessment? Can we bring you into our companies for a super week where you can work in a team and show your leadership and your diverse ways of thinking? So that is not only the benefits, but also ways in which we see success of our students when they graduate and how they end up being promoted and hired and retain their jobs.
Amazing. I love all of that. I wish I would have had that kind of support when I was in college. I have ADHD myself, and that would have been such a game changer for me. And that's really amazing. Our next question, which we saw, you know, a common theme in our Mentimeter poll. Divya also in the chat has asked as well, like how can organizations create a neuro-inclusive culture? And Ed, I'd like to ask that question to you.
Yeah, I think there's probably 3 steps here, and I would, if I can try and almost answer 2 questions at once, relate the same 3 steps to how do we think about, say, inclusive hiring. So I think the first is to talk about neurodiversity, and this is something that anyone in an organization can do, whether this is grassroots advocacy or allyship, or whether this is senior sponsorship, or whether this is something in between. Finding others, finding a platform, expressing interest, particularly I think powerful if you have in any position of responsibility or seniority, expressing its importance and asking for input. I think people are scared to talk about neurodiversity sometimes because they're worried about getting it wrong, sort of opening a Pandora's box. What we've seen is that people in the community really respond positively to organizations that just say that they care about it and where there is a genuine interest. You don't have to be an expert immediately, but starting to talk about neurodiversity and even welcoming input and to say, look, this is something we want to take seriously. Who wants to be part of this? Who has a perspective or an experience maybe they want to share? I think that's how I would start. And again, really valuable, particularly if you're in a position of influence. to do that, to sort of lead the way. So that would be the first thing, and then to kind of relate that to hiring, you know, starting to show that the organization cares about neurodiversity. We work with a lot of big companies. Big companies have careers websites, diversity pages of the careers websites. Very few of them, until we work with them, say anything about welcoming different types of thinker and so on. So again, you sort of put yourself in the mind of one of Jan's students. You know, why would you apply somewhere that looks like it has no interest in people like you? So I think that's powerful as well. Second stage would be awareness building. We know awareness is typically low. We know from our focus groups that sort of basic lack of familiarity, the stereotypes, the cultural ignorance is the biggest barrier in workplaces. And it takes one person in a team, one manager, one colleague, to just not really know what neurodiversity is and, you know, take all of their knowledge from a movie or whatever to effectively exclude somebody. And so I think building awareness is key. I think that makes a significant impact in creating a positive environment. We've seen organizations, we talk about hiring, we've seen organizations more effectively hire people simply through greater awareness. You know, somebody discloses in an interview in an organization where everyone has a basic awareness and enthusiasm for neurodiversity. That's a very different conversation than when somebody discloses where that hasn't been the case. And again, we can relate that to hiring by thinking, you know, can we make sure our recruiters have an awareness of some of these thinking style differences, and how does that translate practically to biases, to expectations? You know, I think most people hiring, if they're really honest with themselves, hire with a picture of the ideal candidate in mind. It's quite difficult to avoid that. Now, I think this is something that relates with all diversity, all inclusion. Really important to challenge that, to think, you know, why am I expecting somebody to present in a certain way, and to be open to different forms of presentation, to have an awareness of neurodiversity. That means, you know, somebody who doesn't make eye contact, somebody who speaks in a flatter pitch. You know, it doesn't mean that they're not interested. It's simply how they present. So I think you can start seeing value from that. So talking about it, building awareness. Last one, I would call that kind of zooming in. So looking more specifically at, in the case of environments, you know, management, HR processes and policies, in the case of hiring, processes and tools used in hiring. In many cases, we found that folks who've become themselves more aware, more familiar with neurodiversity can make some of those adjustments themselves. So people who've had awareness training can start thinking, actually, what about how we onboard in our team? That probably is not going to work that well. You don't need us, you don't need an expensive consultant. You know, folks are starting to actually make those adjustments on the ground. And so again, to relate this to hiring, this would be really making sure that recruiters have some of the right sort of tactical steps in place with interviews, job descriptions, and so on, but also considering things like the process itself, the tools that are used through the lens of neuro-inclusion. So, you know, how are we assessing candidates? What weight does that face-to-face or, you know, virtual interview have? Recognizing that for some people that's a difficult context. You know, is this a role where that's really important, or can we re-weight our assessment? Can we communicate that we've re-weighted our assessment to take the pressure off? Yes, we'll do an interview, but that's not the only thing we're going to appraise you on. And then tools as well. I remember my wife was going for a corporate job. She was asked to sort of self-record a video interview of herself as part of the job application. Now, I think that's something, and I know from friends and our focus groups, that some folks would find particularly challenging. So are these tools, whether they're tests or self-assessments and so on, have we actually run those through the lens of neuro-inclusion? Do we have somebody in the firm who's neurodistinct themselves who could maybe take a look and say, yes, actually, you know what? I hated that thing. God knows how I passed it. So that would be my summary, and I hope I've sort of cross-related this. I did see a lot of questions around hiring. So talk about it, build awareness, and then kind of zoom in.
Absolutely. Yes. No, I'm seeing also in the chat box and in the Q&A, also like retention and collaboration and managing are additionally, some challenges. Ed, can I put you on the spot again? And that I think this would be a great time to talk about managing from like a universal design approach, our ethos, with a person-centered approach as well. Can I have you discuss that?
Yeah, I think we have to, again, we're functioning in a context as any organization where the organization is neurodiverse by definition, in that everybody has a different brain. And although we may have a significant neurodistinct or neurodivergent population, that population may or may not be willing to disclose. And that population may or may not have had the means or the access to diagnosis. We know that people within ethnic minorities and women in the US statistically less likely to have had access to diagnosis. So I think if we restrict our attention only to people who have put their hand up and said, yes, hello, I'm openly and confidently neurodistinct, I think we miss a trick. So universal design, which is a concept that really started with physical space architecture and so on. The idea was, how can we create these spaces that are good for everybody? That is a principle that we can apply, and it's now been applied to things like learning. It can be applied to management. It can be applied to co-working. What are all the things that we can do off the bat that help us include the 100% and not the 80%? And so an example of that would be a manager taking time to ask their team, how do you like to receive instructions? That's universal design. That's not waiting for somebody to say, hey, the way you're giving me instructions is nonsense, it doesn't work for me. It's something that's good for everybody. Now, all of our training at Uptimize marries universal design with what we call person-centered support. So universal design is never going to cover every person's needs, every person's preferences. And so what we need to be able to do is encourage people to come forward with what else they need to be successful, comfortable, and so on, and respond to that in a very personal and human-centered way, right? So not, oh, go and prove it with a doctor's note, right? Mm-hmm. Or this is our process, but actually some humanity in saying, okay, yes, I can understand, these are your needs, and here's how we think we can support them. And so we like to marry those two things, the universal design and the person-centered support, and allowing anybody who needs that support to really be at the center of their own journey.
Great, thank you so much. I think that answered quite a few questions. Jan, I have a question from the Mentimeter. There was a lot of inquiries about, statistics and ROI, but we have a question. What are some of the added or unexpected benefits of hiring from the neurodiverse population? Do you have any stories or successes that you can share, omitting names, of course, with us, of maybe someone who had an intangible benefit of hiring a neurodistinct student?
Yes, we have numerous success stories. One example I'll provide is a student that was meeting with our office. They had a distinct interest in working for a tech company, but lacked a lot of confidence about their ability to succeed in the workforce. So that we see this can happen, that students have the skills and the ability, but there's this confidence piece about their ability to, one, obtain the job, but be able to be successful in a workplace. So this student was working with our office, attending workshops, and we happened to connect them with our partnership with EY. EY was on campus. They did a day of workshops and interviewing, like I referred to earlier, and they connected with this student, had a very successful interview. The student, because they felt recognized and empowered, ended up embarking on the application process and participated in the stages that were all very neurodiverse friendly. because they removed a lot of those barriers the student had faced prior to working with EY, and they were hired. And so the individual graduated from Landmark, was hired by EY, and was fortunate enough that his placement was in the city where he wanted to work, as well as within walking distance, and has been very successful and actually has moved up. He's been promoted since the hire date. So that's one of we have numerous stories like that with other corporations, JPMorganChase and Prudential, but that one really stood out to me as far as the proof is in the pudding.
I love that. Thank you.
Jamel said he's willing to, Jamel's on the call, he's willing to contribute if you'd like any input from him.
Yes, I can allow Jamel to talk. Jamel, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Awesome, awesome. So Jan, I know all too well that story that you're talking about. I think that is truly a success story about this individual who has been able to your point, successfully sustain their role here for the past 2 years. They've been actually promoted and have been very instrumental in helping others go through the process, helping to customize our existing recruiting efforts, and all in all, deliver quality, solid work products that are absolutely necessary and pivotal for us as an organization to remain, I would say, ahead of the curve as it relates to delivering different solutions to our clients. So ironically enough, this same individual that Jane is actually referencing just participated on what we refer to as a virtual tour earlier today with our Australia colleagues, because they're interested in also launching a similar center which leverages specifically neurodistinct talent. So again, all in all, just a great opportunity to have someone not have the largest degree of confidence in their ability, be able to walk through, understand process, understand the fact that this organization, i.e. EY, embraces neurodivergent talent, to have them ultimately apply, land the role immediately after university, and then be able to not just remain successful, but to be able to move up in the organization and then also begin to help others. So super excited.
Great. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing, Jamel. We appreciate your input. And I know that it is always good to hear from the actual organization and saying like, hey, this is actually making a difference. And another prediction that Uptimize had made in our recent article is that we're going to start seeing a lot more companies coming out with statistics and not just these qualitative benefits that they're getting from, an improved culture, but we're going to start seeing, hey, we have had amazing retention rates. We've had amazing cultural benefits, well-being, hiring. During this great resignation, this is going to start coming out a lot more. And so we really appreciate the company's perspective. We have just a few minutes left.
Can I just?
Oh, yes.
Can I just share one thing to that point? And you're absolutely correct. I can tell you from our retention rates that are upward of 90% for our neurodivergent talent, which is significantly different than those of our neurotypicals, as well as qualitative and quantitative measures that support the hour savings and the increase in cost, as well as products that our neurodivergent colleagues have been able to produce. I think those are the metrics that many organizations are going to need to continue to expand programs. But yeah, great call outs.
Thanks so much. I appreciate your input. Okay, yeah, we have a couple minutes left. I think we can do a few questions. I did get one from Divya. Is there a situation where you have a team of people and they don't necessarily know that they are neurodivergent or neurodistinct? Ed, I think we have seen that. Can you answer that question for us?
Yeah, I actually just answered that one in the chat box. I mean, very simply, yes, because of both a lack of cultural awareness and then again a practical lack of access to diagnostic services. So absolutely. And I think what you see, and you have to realize that this whole kind of cultural field has changed a lot over the last few decades. Diagnosis and awareness is far more common and more significant now than it was, say, 30 years ago. So you have cases where you know, a child can be diagnosed, and that can lead to a parent having a later in life diagnosis. Writing a book on this subject, a lot of the people in the community that I've interviewed have had later in life diagnosis. Even people, you know, as young as their 30s or 40s, often haven't had a lifetime with that identity. And so I think that's quite substantial. Yeah, and it does. I just want to kind of make a point here, and I want to echo something that somebody said to me the other day, which is really important, is that we do tend to think now with these programs and hiring, we tend to think, you know, graduates, young talent, the next wave, and we know that that's a wave that's far more broadly, consciously neurodistinct than previously. But we do have a situation where there are older people in the workforce who, through no fault of their own, have patchier resumes than they might through having worked in organizations where there wasn't that sort of neuro-inclusion. They didn't feel that they could be themselves, they didn't feel understood, and so on. I think it's really important if we're looking at true inclusion, and I mean ageism is another big thing in terms of D&I, right? I think we have to broaden to that and to be open to older talent and recognize that that might be the case, and have some empathy when it comes to some of those patchier resumes as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes.
Absolutely. So I think we have a lot of questions to get to, but we're running out of time. I really want to be conscious of that and Zoom fatigue and all of that, but I'm going to give everyone a lot of great resources in the chat. We have a couple I wanted to share with you quickly. If you're new to neurodiversity at work, Uptimize has a great introductory ebook on our website, and you can find that at uptimize.com/download. Jan has also participated in a white paper article. Jan, can you share a little bit about that? And I can put in the link in the chat.
Sure, happy to do so. The article, it's great to have Jamel on the call because he actually was a contributor to the article via an interview. But basically what it does is it talks about all of this really in practice, that universal design at Landmark has now translated into the workforce. And so there's some research and some theory in the article, but the part that I contributed was I interviewed various different inclusive hiring programs and compiled that evidence and shared the findings in the article, which shows the commonalities of each of these various different neuro-inclusive programs, but then the distinct differences, like what do they do in Australia versus the US. And it's a wonderful resource if you're considering this or you have a program in place to see just the continuum of when you're using universal design in a college environment with that research, and then how it's proven in the workplace as far as supervising strategies and how successful it's been. So there's some statistics in there, but definitely would encourage people to read it.
Great. Yes, we did have a lot of questions asking for business statistics, excuse me, and stories. Just so everyone knows, I am loading up the chat box with Jan and Ed's contact information. We had some questions, Jan, if you work internationally, if you work with certain companies, and so I'm going to have them just reach out to you directly to answer any of those questions. I've also linked Ed and Jan's LinkedIn profiles, so that I'm sure that they would love to connect with you. And yeah, totally loaded it up, so that was a little bit overwhelming. I'm sorry about that, but we would love to continue the conversation with anyone here on the call, so please reach out to us. I do get this question every single time. This recording will be available later if you missed some parts of the conversation, if you'd like to revisit or send to colleagues. I'll be sending out an email with all of this information this afternoon with that recording. So thanks everyone so much for your questions. Thanks to Jamel and Jan and Ed for joining us on this talk. And we look forward to seeing you next month at our next talk. Please follow along on LinkedIn. That's where we post all of our monthly webinars coming up. So thanks so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lauren.
Ed.
Thanks, Jamel, as well. Bye-bye.